Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Lucinda Walker. I'm the director of the Norwich Public Library, and the library and the Norwich Historical Society co-host First Wednesdays, the first Wednesday of every month from October to May. And we are getting into the home stretch. I want to encourage you that if you've had a chance to look at the whole booklet for the First Wednesdays program, First Wednesdays takes place at 9 venues across Vermont during these months. If you've looked at the program or you haven't had a chance to look at it and would like to see it, please let me know and I'll get you a copy. But this is the time of year where we look ahead for next year's series. So we're looking to see what programs were held at other libraries this past year that might be of interest to our community. So if you want to look at the program or have a look, let me know, or let me know what types of programs you're looking for. Every year we try to balance out everything from politics, history, art, the humanities in general, but if there's something that really piques your interest, please let me know. First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council. It's supported statewide by the Vermont Department of Libraries, a special cheer for them, and the National Life Group Foundation. Tonight's event is being underwritten by relatives of E.B. White. The Historical Society and the library would like to thank our very generous donors. They are the Friends of the Norwich Public Library, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Ledyard National Bank, and Mascoma Savings Bank. And now I'm going to do a slight plug for the library. We're doing something called Vermont Reads. This is a program sponsored by the Vermont Humanities Council. This year's book is Brown Gold Dreaming, which is a memoir in verse by Jacqueline Woodson. This is an amazing book for all ages. We're so pleased with this choice this year because it means that as a library we can do events across the spectrum. And so the library is focusing on bringing this book to the community, the Upper Valley community at large, starting today through the end of April. There is a lot of information on our website. Copies of the book are available for free at the library. I brought 3 copies tonight if you're interested in picking one up. Read it, pass it along. Just a wonderful book and one that's so important, I think, as we get out of the oomph of winter and look ahead to spring. So that is my plug, shameless plug for the library. And now I'll get back to business. Nancy J. Crumbine is a poet and associate professor of writing and rhetoric at Dartmouth College and a Universalist Unitarian minister. She holds a PhD in philosophy and 2 master's degrees in philosophy and religion. She has lectured widely under the auspices of the New Hampshire and Vermont Humanities Councils, the National Council for the Aging, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and religious and education conferences, both in the US and the UK. In addition to her published academic articles, she is the author of Humility, Anger, and Grace, Meditations Toward a Life That Matters. Nancy will be selling these after the program tonight, and she wants me to let you know that 100% of the proceeds will be going to Earth Justice. So, with all that in mind, would you please join me in welcoming Nancy Crumbine.
Lucinda is so great. It's the first time she's come to hear me speak. She's always out of town when I come. Do you remember what I did here the last time I came? I didn't do Rachel Carson here yet, did I? So I'd like you to roll right in for next year. Nancy Crumbine on Rachel Carson. It's one of my favorite talks. But tonight you're in for a real treat because it's going to be less of me talking and quite a lot of reading of this wonderful author, E.B. White. But thank you to Lucinda and this wonderful Norwich Library. Thank you to Allie White, who is not a relative of E.B. White, but is responsible for First Wednesdays. She's the goddess behind this program that's been going on how many years? 4 or 5 years now?
Oh no, since 1998.
Oh. No, but I've been giving lectures for it for quite a long time, but I don't think since '98. Anyway, Allie has been wonderfully generous in giving me a number of talks every year and in different libraries. And a few years ago, she said, know anything about E.B. White? And I said, no. She said, well, read him. You're going to love him. And I'd like you to do a talk on him. And what a gift it was. So I immersed myself in the essays and have been saying yes to any invitations to talk about him. I have books over here for you to see afterwards, books by E.B. White, books about E.B. White, including this brand new one I just found out about this morning thanks to Margaret Bragg. I'll have that over there. Also, I have a wonderful copy of St. Nicholas, which is a children's magazine. How many of you have heard of St. Nicholas at the turn of the century? I'll talk more about it later, but I have a copy of a leather-bound copy of some of the magazines there, and Louisa May Alcott is published in there. There's a children's magazine that published children authors, one of whom, of course, was E.B. White. So take a look at that. It's really lovely. So I've given many talks of many authors over the years. Usually, after I've read through their work, I have a great deal to say, unpacking them, connecting them with other writers, discussing their use of line breaks, their hidden or not so hidden spirituality, or in the case of Dickinson, saying, well, I have no idea what is going on here, but here are a few ideas. But tonight, how's the volume? Are we okay? Tonight, I am presenting the least obscure essayist in American literature. Prose that needs no unpacking, and without argument, the least hidden, most accessible, and clearest writer of his century. I read E.B. White, and I have nothing to say, which is about the highest compliment I can pay. Except to hand you the book and say, read this. Or, as is the case tonight, listen to this. So my entire message tonight, for my students here, my thesis for the evening is very simple. Go home and read E.B. White's essays. Reread, of course, his 3 children's books, but also please read his essays. And if you wanted to know which one to start with, I would suggest One Man's Meat. His clarity, his humor, his stunning timeliness, and his spirituality. What time could be better than this, our winter of discontent, to read E.B. White? So I will begin with a favorite passage of mine, since it was written on my birthday, from Point of My Compass, a 1962 collection of essays from the New Yorker. Then I'll go into the biography of his life, and then read according to categories. I will be talking religion, politics, animals, etc. So let's just start out with a reading. And there's another rule of good writing. You know, I teach writing over across the river, and one of the rules of quoting is that you're never supposed to quote unless the author says it's so much better than you. And as I said, in this case, it's always better than what I could do. So, Turtle Bay, October 18th, 1956. This is a dark morning in the apartment, but the block is gay with yellow moving vans disgorging Mary Martin's belongings in front of a house a couple of doors east of here, into which, I should say from the looks of things, she is moving. People's lives are so exposed at moments like this, their possessions lying naked in the street, the light of day searching out every bruise and mark of indoor living. It is an unfair expose, end tables with nothing to be at the end of, standing lamps with their cords tied up in curlers, bottles of vermouth craning their long necks from cartons of personal papers, and every wastebasket carrying its small cargo of miscellany. The vans cause a stir in the block. Heads appear in the windows of number 230 across the way. Passers-by stop on the sidewalk and stare brazenly into the new home through the open door. I have a mezzanine seat for the performance. Like a peeping Tom, I lounge here in my bathrobe and look down, held in the embrace of a common cold. before which scientists stand in awe, although they have managed to split the atom, infect the topsoil with strontium-90, break the barrier of sound, and build the Lincoln Tunnel. He goes on at some length about the details of Mary Martin's stuff and this trouble the movers have moving potted plants, large potted rubber plants with which the mover is doing a waltz. He goes on about a cat moving up the lattice and knocking on his window. And then this is so classic White. So he starts with mundane, very detailed, and then listen to what happened. And well, he already has moved from the mundane of Mary Martin's stuff to strontium-90, right? And that I should tell you the title of this essay is Sootfall and Fallout. The air is hazy smoke and fumes being pressed downward in what the smog reporter of the time calls a wigwam effect. This is 1956, by the way, before the EPA. I don't know what new gadget the factories of Long Island are making today to produce such a foul vapor, probably a new jet applicator for the relief of nasal congestion. But whatever it is, I would swap it for the breath of fresh air. On every night, on every slight stirring of the breeze, the willow behind Mary Martin's wigwam lets drop 2 or 3 stylish yellow leaves, and they swim lazily down like golden fish to where Paul, the handyman, waits with his broom. In the ivy border along the wall, watchful of the cat, 3 rushes hunt about among the dry leaves. I cannot pronounce 3 thrushes, but I can see 3 thrushes from this window, and this is the first autumn I have ever seen 3 at once. An October miracle. I think they are hermits, but the visibility is so poor, I can't be sure. This section of Manhattan boasts the heaviest sootfall in town, and the United States of America boasts the heaviest fallout in the world. And when you take the sootfall and fallout and bring smog in on top of them, I feel I'm in a perfect position to discuss the problem of universal pollution. The papers, of course, are full of the subject these days as they follow the presidential campaigners around the nation from one contaminated area to the other. So, he was born the youngest child of 6, so he had wonderful freedom, and he spent much of it outside. He also suffered terribly as a child with great anxiety, which he suffered from, anxiety and depression he suffered from throughout his whole life. I mentioned St. Nicholas Magazine. It was a magazine, first editor was Mary Mapes Dodge, name some of you may know. It was a part of the Back to Nature movement, the end of the 19th century. And as I said, it published children's submissions. And among its well-known authors, publishing at age 10, 12, 14, Louisa May Alcott, Rachel Carson, William Faulkner, Bennett Cerf, Kay Boyle, Edmund Wilson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Stephen Benet, Robert Benchley, Vita Sackville West, Celia Thaxter, and Catherine Sargent, who became Catherine Engel, who became Mrs. White. More on her later. Actually, please write in that you want me to come back and talk about Catherine White. What an amazing woman. I really want to develop a talk on her. E.B. White went to Cornell, where he acquired the nickname of Andy. And then in 22, after he graduated from Cornell, he took a road trip with a Model T across the country, wrote about it, of course, a delightful little piece. And then in 1923, he bought a first-class ticket on the SS Buford, and there was a boat going up to Alaska. And he bought this first-class ticket knowing that he would run out of money about halfway up. He bought it only to a certain town, but halfway up to where he was headed. And so when it was time for him to get off, he asked if he could work, and he was hired then as well, let me tell you in his own words. This is a letter to his mother, and it was posted in Seward, Alaska, where I have been thanks to my partner Lori, and so this letter resonates with me. Dear darling mother, it was the evening of July 24th that I put to sea in this ponderous vessel. With $40, I bought myself a first-class passage to Skagway. I liked the name. Then he goes on to describe, in a small bay of Vancouver Island one evening, we passed the Henderson. President Harding waved his handkerchief, and we stopped for a salute. A great change came over me at Skagway. I suddenly appeared in a white coat. I suddenly became associated with brooms, mops, pails of slop water, and other paraphernalia of the great service world. I suddenly, without warning the delightful wives and sisters of the members of the Chamber of Commerce, began to serve night lunch to them in the dining saloon. The shock to the company was terrific. Many of them had thought I was orthodox socially. Lord, they had danced with me on those nights from Seattle to Skagway in the dance hall. I shall not attempt to describe in this letter my extreme enjoyment of all of this. I don't know how I happened to think of such a funny thing to do, but I did, and I'm having a wonderful time. You can imagine the shock of those fancy people on that boat. 1925, he had submitted a few writings to the New Yorker, which had just begun a few years or so before. He walked into the office at the invitation of Catherine Sargent Engel, and was hired after much discussion and trying to persuade him. He was hired. The editor then was Harold Ross, and if any of you know the history of the New Yorker, Harold Ross was the founding editor, and without Catherine Engel, it would have collapsed on numbers of occasions. And Andy has a wonderful tribute to, or White has a wonderful tribute to Catherine about those years. Became very close friends with James Thurber, who also was writing for the New Yorker, and they together wrote the book whose title is my favorite of all titles, 1929. The title is Sex Necessary? It's a little dated, unfortunately, but it's hilarious, as you can tell. In 1929, he was married. He and Catherine married. Catherine had 2 children, Nancy and Roger, and we have 2 of her grandchildren. Do I have that right? Sitting in the second pew here, so hopefully we'll hear from them in the question and answer period. But I do want to read you a letter that, so White was, as I said, anxious and nervous in different situations, and and in the situation where his wife, Catherine, was pregnant, he was extremely nervous, and so he wrote her a letter through his dog's voice. So this is a letter from Daisy to Mrs. White. I'm just reading part of it. It goes on for some length. Dear Mrs. White, she refers to Josephine, who's the maid. I like having Josephine here in the morning, although I suppose I will get less actual thinking done, as I used to do my thinking mornings in the bathroom. White has been stewing around for 2 days now, a little bit worried because he is not sure that he has made you realize how glad he is that there is to be what the column writer in the Mirror calls a blessed event. So I am taking this opportunity, Mrs. White, to help him out to the extent of writing you a brief note, which I haven't done in quite a long time, but have been a little sick myself, as you know. Well, the truth is, White is beside himself, and would have said more about it, but is holding himself back, not wanting to appear ludicrous to a veteran mother. What he feels, he told me, is a strange, queer, tight, little twitchy feeling around, around the inside of his throat whenever he thinks that something is happening which will require so much love, and all on account of you being so wonderful. Parentheses. I am not making myself clear, I'm afraid, but on the occasions when White has spoken privately with me about this, he was in no condition to make himself clear either, and I am just doing the best I can in my own way. The letter goes on, and then at one point, the dog says, oh, he's also very nervous and wants me to make sure that you know that he's loves you not just because you're a mother, but because you're also a person. This is 1930. And indeed, she was a person. So, Joel was born. And in 1931, they bought, living in New York, still working for the New Yorker, they bought their beloved farm in Brooklyn, Maine. How many of you have seen the farm? You can see it from the road. I was able to rent a cottage. It was totally serendipitous. The day after I first gave this talk a couple years ago, saw an ad for a cottage nearby, and I got a deal on the rent, and I went up for a week, and I stalked the farm. There are all these signs, no trespassing, but I ended up meeting some friends of the Whites, and in fact, I was offered a chance to meet Roger Engel, and I was too chicken. I was terrified. I have such reverence for him, another wonderful person that I could give a talk about. Anyway, it was extraordinary. I got to go to the church where they went at least once and visit their graves. They're right across the street from the church, right in Brooklyn. It's a beautiful little town. And also the library that they supported. Speaking of libraries, they gave lots of money and lots of time. Catherine spent lots and lots of time helping that little library. And they were thrilled when they found out I was researching White and pulled out folders of news clips, etc., and were very helpful to me. So 31, they bought the farm and we're back and forth. And then in 38, this big move out of New York, which was very difficult on Catherine, but E.B. White felt he had to do it. And then from the farm, then he wrote for Harper's Magazine. He took a break from New Yorker, he left New Yorker, wrote One Man's Meat, a series of columns in Harper's Magazine. Then the war broke out. Harold Ross needed them back. He was short-staffed at the New Yorker, so they moved back, rented a series of apartments, and they were back and forth between New York and the farm in Brooklyn, Maine. For the 1945, Stuart Little, his first children's book came out, and in 1948, he was awarded an honorary degree here at Dartmouth, also at Yale and University of Maine, but they don't count. So I have a letter. I want to read a little. It's just too juicy and local not to read a little bit of this letter he wrote to Catherine, June 1948. The Hanover deal was both good and bad, but I came through it all right and am no worse for the wear. It ended happily enough, but I had a frightful night Saturday night at the inn, caused partly by my natural uneasiness and fear of platforms. He was terrified of public. He never spoke in public. If people came to his office at the New Yorker, he would crawl out the back window so he wouldn't have to see them. He was very, very, unless he had a couple of martinis, I'm told. Do you remember that? Yeah? Oh boy. Okay, I'm dying to talk to you all. Uneasiness and fear, and partly by Dartmouth's over-conscientious system of providing each honorary candidate with an escort. Mine was named Billy Pulley, a very nice boy from Ohio, who got me on the phone the minute I arrived, weary, in my bedroom, and who insisted on escorting me every second. He would have escorted me to the bathroom if I had let him, and he would have brushed my teeth. It goes on to about President Dickey. He was supposed to go after the dinner to President Dickey's house, but he was too tired and didn't even bother calling to tell him he couldn't come, etc. And then the next day, anyway, it goes on at some length. Anyway, we all lined up. This is the next morning for graduation. And we all lined up after a bit, and outside, the senior class lined up on the quadrangle in 2 straight rows, making an aisle. They still do this today. The faculty and all the honorary people march through this aisle, the seniors. It's a wonderful tradition. Seniors lined up in 2 straight rows, making an aisle, and then after a long, long wait with no chance to sit down, we started out, led by the president, and marched or shuffled through the human aisle while the seniors gave us the eye. The only thing good about it, from my point of view, was that if I had started to fall, there would have certainly been a man there to catch me. They march on to the bema, where the graduation was in those days. And he goes on so the president, I teetered over to where the president was standing and to receive his honorary degree and his hood, and was followed by a couple of friars bearing the white hood. The hood was white, quite big, and shaped like a loose-fitting horse collar. The president cited me for literary bravery, parentheses, he little knew, end parentheses. The hood was slipped over my head, the diploma was slipped into my hand, and there was some clapping and a couple of boos. And I walked back to sit down. I doubt that there were any boos, but I guess it must have been when I reached over to pick the program off the chair that my hood got hung up on Ben Ames Williams, who was a local author, also got an honorary degree that day. Anyway, when I got seated, the thing was up over my face, as in falconry. I truly lived up to the New Yorker's reputation for waggishness and clowning as I sat there feebly pulling at the hood, a fully masked doctor of letters, a headless poet. I gave the boys their money's worth and didn't mind it particularly, as I wasn't really sure that anything much was wrong. Some learned man in the row behind me finally reached forward and rearranged me into some semblance of academic dignity. So, then he wrote a lot of books. A lot of his essays were put into books. Here is New York. How many of you have read that beautiful little essay, short book about New York? Charlotte's Web in 1952. It took 3 years to write Charlotte's Web. When the publisher really pushed him, he took another year. After 2 years, pushed him, and then he took another year. He did intense research on spiders. He wanted to pick the exact right species of spiders. Is that the right word, species of spiders? Help me. Francesca, is that right? Anyway. He did research that I obviously haven't done on spiders. And the details in Charlotte's Web about all the animals are precise and meticulous. Also, how many of you have read The Trumpet of the Swan? It's not as popular, it's not as well known. I actually had never read it. What a gorgeous book. And again, the details of the animals. It is so beautifully instructive. And of course, he never wrote down to children. It was one of his big things. He found that just absolutely horrible. Then The Elements of Style. How many of you remember this from your college years? It's still the best book out there, in particular White's essay in there. The Trumpet of the Swan, etc. He won the Pulitzer Prize. In 1963, he got the Presidential Medal of Honor. And then in 1978, a Pulitzer. And for the first time ever, the Pulitzer was given to somebody not for one book, which it always is, but for a lifetime achievement of all his work. It was quite something. He died in 1985, and as I said, buried in Brooklyn in a very simple grave next to his beloved wife, Catherine. So that's my summary of his life, and now we're going to launch into, any questions on that? No? Good. Okay. So, I'll launch into a few quotes along thematic, and this first one that I want to share with you is from his essay, Sabbath Morn, written in 1939, and it's such a beautiful glimpse into his view of religion, number one, but also into his living room at the farm. By the way, the farm has been preserved at the Whites' wishes that it be preserved as a private residence so that it wouldn't be turned into Charlotte's Cafe or some god-awful thing. So it's really, if you are in the area, it is really worth driving by. It's absolutely beautifully kept, well-kept farm right on Allen's Cove. A gorgeous setting. So this is called Sabbath Morn. It is Sunday, mid-morning. Sunday in the living room. Sunday in the kitchen. Sunday in the woodshed. Sunday down the road in the village. I hear the bells calling me to share God's grace. I enter the living room, a Sunday man, carrying a folder of work. Clippings, letters, small thoughts in plain wrappers, a writer's reticule. I stand a moment listening to the bells 3 miles away, the hopeful, chiding bells. Procrastinating, I snap the radio on, and it is Sunday in the radio cabinet. More like the Master is my daily prayer, a hymn singer in the Nazarene Church of South Blur, Maine, into my living room, spreading a frail soprano along the shelf among the geraniums and the freesia and the hyacinths. Where stand the authors without their jackets? Henry James, Willa Cather, D.H. Lawrence. Their heads unbowed, looking straight ahead. We dedicate this hymn to Miss Nellie Blur, a shut-in of South Bend. Next Sunday we shall take up the first of the Beatitudes, and until then, God bless you. I sit down, opening the work folder. An organ prelude. The organ makes a curious whine, sentimental, grandiose, half cello, etc. He goes on to something like, praise God from whom all blessings flow. Hesitatingly, the assembled voices, embarrassed at the sudden sound of their once-a-week excursion in piety, the too-weak, the overstrong. Dad? My boy enters the living room where Sunday is. He wears corduroy trousers and carries a police whistle. What? It sounds as though you had turned the bottom part of this house into a church. Yes, it does. Acts, the 11th chapter, Acts, the 11th chapter. The little boy picks up a book, subsides, unlistening, discarding the world of the room, the world of the radio, setting up for himself a tight little world inside the covers of a book. There are many worlds. I see by my folder that in Flushing, now notice this term, I see by my folder that in Flushing, the village of tomorrow, this is the World's Fair, 1939. The village of tomorrow, the people are building a temple to the Lord at a cost of $250,000, or is it $3? The world of tomorrow has so many responsibilities, and on top of everything, religion. Okay. So much for religion. So, moving on to politics, and I have picked tonight what I think is most germane to our troubled times. So, just a little background, the Munich Agreement. Everybody remember that? It was settled to permit Nazi Germany to annex portions of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain agreed to appease Hitler. The purpose of the conference was to discuss the future of this part of Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, in the face of ethical demands made by Hitler. Ethnic demands, excuse me. That was a slip. The agreement was signed by Germany, France, and the UK and Italy. Czechoslovakia was not invited to that meeting. White writes in the New Yorker, October 1938. The Munich Agreement was September 30th, 1938. So he writes in October, long before the coming of the cold, I was on the barn roof, laying clear cedar shingles 5 inches to the weather. My neighbors' roofs all showed signs of activity, so I built some staging and mounted my own beanstalk to see what I could see. It seems a long while ago that I was up there, hanging on by the seat of my pants. Those clear days at the edge of the frost, with a view of pasture, woods, sea, hills, and my pumpkin patch stretched out below in serene abundance. I stayed on the barn, steadily laying shingles all during the days when Mr. Chamberlain, El Duce, and the Fuhrer were arranging their horse trade. It seemed a queer place to be during a world crisis, an odd thing to be doing, there was no particular reason for making my roof tight, as the barn contained nothing but a croquet set, some swallows' nests, and a stuffed moose head. In my trance-like condition, waiting for the negotiations to end, I added a cupola to the roof to hold a vane that would show which way the wind blew. In some respects, though, a barn is the best place anybody could pick for sitting out a dance with a prime minister and a demagogue. There is a certain clarity on a high roof, a singleness of design in the orderly work of laying shingles, snapping the chalk line, laying the butts to the line, picking the proper width shingle to give an adequate lap. One's perspective at that altitude is unusually good. Who has the longer view of things anyway? A prime minister in a closet or a man on a barn roof? I'm down now, the barn is tight, and the peace is preserved. It is the ugliest peace the earth has ever received for a Christmas present. Old England eating swastika for breakfast instead of kipper is a sight I had as lief not live to see. And though I'm no warrior, I would gladly fight for the things Nazism seeks to destroy. Anne Murrell Lindbergh came out with a book around this time in her desperate attempt to support her husband's nationalism. He was head of an organization called America First and was very supportive of the Nazis, made several trips over there, was awarded an award by anyway, she wrote a book called The Waves of the Future, isolationist book, and E.B. White graciously took her on in one of the essays. I will not be reading from this essay, but I do want to read another example of how he weaves this incredible detail of his life on the farm, this incredible beauty and love of nature, with the politics, and not holding back at all around the political reality that he is objecting to. This was written September 1939, and of course, September 1st, 1939, Germany, ignoring previous agreements, rolled their tanks into Poland. War comes to each of us in his own fashion. Early on that Sunday, when England and France finally lost their patience, wishing to put my affairs in order, I cleaned my comb and brush, pouring a few drops of household ammonia into a bowl of water, running the comb through the brush, then brushing the comb with a nail brush. At breakfast, there was a house guest in a bathrobe. She approached the war intellectually through Versailles. After breakfast, I went to the garage and sorted some nails, putting the clabbered nails together in a bunch, the sixpenny nails together, the boarding nails together in cans. The blade of my jackknife being stiff, I eased it with a few drops of penetrating oil. We decided we would go to church, a solemn place for a solemn hour. The preparation was hurried, as though we were organizing a picnic on the spur of the moment. Church is at 10:30 here. The little boy was in tears, is Joel, of course. The little boy was in tears about having to wear the blue suit, yet wanting to go. I wore a hat I found in a closet. The minister, a young fellow I recently sold some old hens to for $1 apiece, said he believed the meek would inherit the earth. We sang, "Am I a soldier of the cross? Are there no foes for me to fight?" The shopkeeper passed the plate. When we got home, I went out to the barn to fix some chum bait, and somebody came out after a while and announced, "Dinner and the king." The words came with painful slowness as we all sat and chewed. Thus began the Second War, for democracy. That, of course, was King George VI's speech. And if you haven't seen the movie The King's Speech, do so. Sorry, that's my authoritarian professorial personality leaking out. After the war, he was, I'm skipping so much, it's so hard. After the war, he was very concerned about the House Un-American Activity Committee, and he wrote this letter to the New York Herald Tribune, which had, the New York Herald Tribune in December of '47 had supported the right of the movie industry in Hollywood to blacklist, and the very famous Hollywood 10 that were blacklisted. They were put in jail first and then blacklisted for refusing to cooperate with HUAC, the House Un-American Activity Committee. And they refusing to answer and to give names, they were put in prison and then blackballed and not able to work ever again in Hollywood. Well, until finally this horrible committee was done away with, late 50s. So the Herald Tribune, so he wrote a letter to the Herald Tribune, November 1947. To the New York Herald Tribune, I am a member of a party of one, and I live in an age of fear. Again, I picked this obviously for current reasons. Nothing lately has unsettled my party and raised my fears so much as your editorial on Thanksgiving Day, suggesting that employees should be required to state their beliefs in order to hold their jobs. Some of you may remember this. You had to sign loyalty oaths in your own work area. The idea is inconsistent with our constitutional theory and has been stubbornly opposed by watchful men since the early days of the Republic. It's hard for me to believe that the Herald Tribune is backing away from the fight, and I can only assume that your editorial writer, in a hurry to get home for Thanksgiving, tripped over the First Amendment and thought it was the office cat. He makes the unpalatable palatable with his humor, just time and time again. The investigation of alleged communists by the Thomas Committee has been a confusing spectacle for all of us. I believe its implications are widely misunderstood and that the outcome is grave beyond exaggeration. The essence of our political theory in this country is that a man's conscience shall be private, not a public affair, and that only his deeds and words shall be open to survey, censure, and to punishment. I think security in critical times takes care of itself if the people and the institutions take care of themselves. First in line is the press. Security for me took a tumble not when I read that there were communists in Hollywood, but when I read your editorial in praise of loyalty testing and thought control. Your editorialist said he hoped the companies, in checking for loyalty, would use their powers sparingly and wisely. That is a wistful idea. One need only watch totalitarians at work to see that once men gain power over other men's minds, that power is never used sparingly and wisely, but lavishly and brutally, and with unspeakable results. If I must declare today that I am not a communist, tomorrow I shall have to testify that I am not a Unitarian. One of my favorite quotes. And the day after, that I never belonged to a Dahlia Club. It is not a crime to believe anything at all in America. To date, it has not been declared illegal to belong to the Communist Party. Yet 10 men have been convicted not of wrongdoing, but of wrong believing. That is news in this country, and if I have not misread history, it is bad news. They went on, the New York Tribune, in the same issue that they published his letter, wrote a rebuttal of it, calling him probably the most dangerous single element, part of the most dangerous single element in our confused and complicated society. And it went back and forth. E.B. White wrote another. But it comes up in many of his essays in this period. During the war, going back now to the war, he published a series of essays in the New Yorker that were collected in a book called The White Flag. And this is just an amazing collection. And it was given to the Dartmouth seniors, actually. At some point, he made a hilarious comment about that. There are two quotes from that book I'd like to share with you. And one is because it's so related to the events of the last week. This is December 30th, 1944, in the New Yorker. Last week, when things were at a low point in Europe, we sat reading the paper, trying to figure out who was going to win. Just a nervous little homebody in a sack suit trying to unravel supply lines, spearheads, flank movements, reinforcements, armor, weather, and the whole impossible mystery of modern tactical warfare. We got mired, as any civilian does. But in the middle of this imbecile business, our eye went over to a photograph on an inside page of the paper, and something about the picture stopped us cold. It was a little out of date, maybe, but it showed a couple of Yanks straightening up the inside of a synagogue in Holland, which had been desecrated by Germans on an earlier visit. Here was the thing that was a way of getting forgotten. Here was the thing that was a way of getting forgotten in the middle of a war. And we were reminded rather sharply that there is an idea that travels with Allied armor, an idea that travels with Allied armor, and that it is neither a new idea nor one about which any American soldier or civilian need feel the slightest misgivings. Anyone who isn't sure who is going to win, those who would liberate the spirit of those who would calcify it, had better quit fiddling with newspapers and armies. There is not much at the moment to indicate that 45 will be a happy year, but for those who fight along with this main idea, whether in the glint of battle or in the uneasy chair of civil life, the year is already clothed in a certain historical radiance like that of stars and of the first magnitude. And on a slightly lighter note, 1946, after the war is over, he was a great, he had fabulous writings about against nationalism in favor of United Nations. 1946. At their earliest convenience, the delegates to the United Nations organization should form an orchestra. There must be among those 700 men and women enough fiddlers, flautists, cellists, trombonists, and drummers to make up a sizable band, and if the delegates were to organize one and perform together, the effect on the world would be incalculable. Eleanor Roosevelt could learn the triangle. Once a week, all deliberations, all matters of state should be put aside and the public invited to the Assembly Hall to hear that rarest of sounds, the concord of nations. Next morning, the papers, instead of carrying the latest installment in the long and uneasy story of international dissension, could report that the second movement had never been more solidly handled by the strings, and that Wyszynski turned in a masterful performance on the Glockenspiel, etc. There is, in fact, great need that the United Nations delegates find some human activity or pastime which will illustrate people's ability to lose themselves in a universal theme, to harmonize and to create beauty by following a single score rather than 51 separate scores. So, his love of dogs, I just have to read you a short of his, Fred was his beloved dachshund, and to just give you a little background, you remember who Brandeis was? Louis Brandeis and Dean Acheson, Secretary. Dean Acheson was Secretary of State under Truman, and of course, Louis Brandeis was the greatest Supreme Court justice in the history of the United States, in my humble opinion. But this is about Fred, his dachshund. It's in the essay called Bedfell. Quote, "I just saw an eagle go by," Fred would say. "It was carrying a baby." This was not precisely a lie. Fred was like a child in many ways and sought always to blow things up to proportions that satisfied his imagination and his love of adventure. He was a Cecil B. DeMille of dogs. He was a zealot, and I have just been reminded of him by a quote from one of the Democrats sharing my bed, Atchison quoting Brandeis. Quote, "The greatest dangers to liberty," said Mr. Brandeis, "lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning but without understanding." Fred saw in every bird, every squirrel, every housefly, every rat, every skunk, every porcupine, a security risk and a present danger to his republic. He had a dossier on almost every living creature, as well as on several inanimate objects, including my son's football. (1938) on television. It must have been 2 years ago that I attended a television demonstration at which it was shown beyond reasonable doubt that a person sitting in one room could observe the nonsense taking place in another. Can you imagine being a grown-up seeing television for the first time? This is 1938. I recall being more amused by what was happening in the tangible room where I sat than by what appeared in the peephole of science. The images were plain enough, however, and by paying attention, I could see the whites of pretty women's eyes. Clearly, the race today is between loud speaking and soft, between the things that are and the things that seem to be, between the chemist of RCA and the angel of God. Radio has already given sound a wide currency, and sound effects are taking the place once enjoyed by sound itself. Television will enormously enlarge the eye's range, and like radio, will advertise the elsewhere. Together with the tabs, the mags, and the movies, it will insist that we forget the primary and the near in favor of the secondary and the remote. More hours in every 24 will be spent digesting ideas, sounds, images, distant and concocted. In sufficient accumulation, radio sounds and television sights may become more familiar to us than their originals. A door closing, heard over the air, a face contorted, seen in the panel of light, these will emerge as the real and the true. And when we bang the door of our own cell or look into another's face, the impression will be of mere artifice. I like to dwell on this quaint time when the solid world becomes make-believe, McCarthy corporeal and Bergen stuffed, when all is reversed and we shall be like the insane to whom the antics of the sane seem the crazy twistings of a Greek. When I was a child, people simply looked about them and were moderately happy. Today, they peer beyond the 7 seas, bury themselves, waist deep in tidings, and by and large, what they see and hear makes them unutterably sad. So I'm not going to leave you there. I'm going to pull us back up. And I want to make sure to leave time for... I have to read you this one thing. This is from Sims' book. It's a wonderful book, The Story of Charlotte Webb. It's a biography, but it's focused on how Charlotte Webb got his whole life. It's a whole life biography, but with a focus on his love of animals. But Sims has wonderful quotes collected here in this quote. In everyday life, White saw animals with the view of a farmer and an amateur naturalist. He knew how to increase egg production among his chickens, how to dock a lamb's tail, how to give a pig an enema. Yet apparently without a flicker of what a psychologist would call cognitive dissonance, he also saw animals as personality-rich companions on his own fanciful journey. He interpreted a Boston Terrier's bark as, quote, "I'm in love and I'm going crazy," end quote. When his henhouse's brooder stove burned itself out, he said he found the chicks, quote, "standing around with their collars turned up, blowing on their hands and looking like a snow removal gang under the L on a bitter winter's midnight," end quote. Of his legendarily stubborn dachshund Fred, White wrote, quote, "And when I answer his peremptory scratch at the door and hold the door open for him to walk through, he stops in the middle and lights a cigarette just to hold me up." All right, so I'm going to end with reading from the two children's books. How many of you read Charlotte's Web in the last couple of years? How many have never read this book? Anybody here not read the book? Read it, darling. Okay. So it's the most famous opening of any children's book. This is, by the way, is the most read children's book, most published children's book in the world. And but when it was first came out, it was shocking and forbidden in some libraries, even taken off shelves. It starts like no other children's book in the world. Where's Papa going with that axe? And I'll just read you the first page. Said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," she replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything. So your father has decided to do away with it." This is a children's book opening with this. "Do away with it," shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it? Just because it's smaller than others?" Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father's right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet. The earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself," yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble, now run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing, a little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of." A queer look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. So the young gentleman who hasn't read this book, I hope that entices you to read it. Stuart Little is my favorite book, and my dearest friend, David Chambers, a world-renowned lawyer, retired from University of Michigan Law School, told me that it was the best book that he has ever read, bar none, and that the last class of the term, every year, to his seniors, he reads the last chapter of Stuart Little to them. So I'm going to end with just a brief part of this last part of the book. At the end, he's looking for his beloved bird. He's off Margola, and he runs into a repairman who says, "Which direction are you headed?" he asked. For those of you who haven't read this book, Stuart Little is a tiny little mouse that speaks human and dresses humanly, etc. What? Yes? I thought somebody said it wasn't a mouse. Did I have that wrong? I have these brain little moments here. Stuart Little. He's so himself, I forget that he's a mouse. Which direction are you headed, he asked. North, said Stuart. North is nice, said the repairman. I've always enjoyed going north. Of course, southwest is a fine direction, too. Yes, I suppose it is, said Stuart thoughtfully. And there's east, continued the repairman. I once had an interesting experience on an easterly course. Do you want me to tell you about it? No, thanks, said Stuart. The repairman seemed disappointed, but he kept right on talking. There's something about north, he said, something that sets it apart from all other directions. A person who is heading north is not making any mistake, in my opinion. That's the way I look at it, said Stuart. I rather expect that from now on I shall be traveling north until the end of my days. Worst things that could happen to a person, said the repairman. Yes, I know, answered Stuart. Following a broken telephone line north, I have come upon some wonderful places, continued the repairman. Swamps where cedars grow and turtles wait on logs, but not for anything in particular. Fields bordered by crooked fences broken by years of standing still. Orchards so old they have forgotten where the farmhouse is. In the north, I have eaten my lunch in pastures rank with ferns and junipers, all under fair skies with the wind blowing. My business has taken me into spruce woods on winter nights where the snow lay deep and soft, a perfect place for a carnival of rabbits. I have sat at peace on the freight platforms of railroad junctions in the north, in the warm hours and with the warm smells. I know fresh lakes in the north, undisturbed except by fish and hawk, and of course by the telephone company, which has to follow its nose. I know all these places well. They are a long way from here. Don't forget that. And a person who is looking for something doesn't travel very fast. Well, that's perfectly true, said Stuart. Well, I guess I'd better be going. Thank you for your friendly remarks. Not at all, said the repairman. Hope you find that bird. Stuart rose from the ditch, climbed into his car, and started up the road that led toward the north. The sun was just coming up over the hills on his right. As he peered ahead into the great land that stretched before him, the way seemed long, but the sky was bright, and he somehow felt he was headed in the right direction. Here endeth the reading. And now we will open it for questions and conversation. Yes.
I wonder if you mentioned that Charlotte's Web didn't find shelf space on some library shelves when it was first published. Is that correct?
I said that, but I don't know anything more than that. Does anyone know about the history of Charlotte Webb's publication?
I've heard a little bit that it had been banned, including more recently. But that it made the top list of banned books, but I didn't see why.
That was my question. What was the reason?
I heard one reason was a religious reason. This was more recent, and it was something about, this was, I forget what country, I just read about it, but Muslim belief being that they were the pig. You know, more.
Oh, wow.
But I don't know.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I think it has to do with the anthropomorphizing of the animals.
Yeah.
Just that, I hadn't heard any particular religion, but just that was.
Yes, so
The violence of the first page is
the violence of the first page, the anthropomorphizing of animals, and the anthropomorphizing of animals, by the way, is a whole nother talk, and it's so interesting, and it ties in with Jane Goodall, and how shamed she was and discounted as an inadequate scientist because she named her subjects that she was studying, the chimpanzees, etc. Yes.
I think the other thing was that the vocabulary was considered too sophisticated.
Yes.
Maybe that was said, I couldn't hear.
No, it wasn't.
But that it was not a child
Yes, yes.
Which is part of the beauty.
Absolutely. And there's, in the interview that he did at the Paris Review with George Plimpton, he specifies that it's such a travesty to talk down to children. And so did everybody hear that the sophistication of the language, the fact that it wasn't a traditional child's book, it was really quite radical in its day, that it was such a sophisticated narrative.
It used to be that there were a certain number of words you could use in a children's book. And he obviously discounted that.
Yes, yes. Stuart Little, of course, was very controversial because he had Stuart Little actually born from a human family. And there's a story of Harold Ross coming into the office and saying, "You've made one major mistake here. You should have had Stuart Little adopted." And apparently E.B. White was quite worried about that for a long time, but then he got these tons and tons of letters from kids loving the book and not bothered by that issue at all. Question? Yes?
You didn't read from Trump to the Swan,
I didn't.
and I wonder where you place that story in his work.
Well, it's the last children's book, and I think it's not read enough. It's absolutely beautiful. I actually heard it on a tape. So I actually have a different relationship to it than having actually read the book. But
That he reads, that he read on the tape.
yes, yeah. It's not. Well, I don't think I want to say any more about that. Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah. How would you characterize the difference?
It's not as cozy.
Yeah, it's not as cozy. That's true. Yeah, but the natural detail is profound.
Oh, yeah. I love it.
Yeah, yeah. But again, all his quote children's books are very readable and wonderful for adult reading. So don't hesitate with that. So are there other questions? Because I have one other thing I'd love to share with you, just talk it through a little bit. One of the delights of researching somebody like E.B. White is discovering that we have mutual friends, which is to say, as I said earlier, I hope you invite me back to talk about Rachel Carson, who obviously is not a personal friend, but she's my hero of heroes. And their relationship, discovering their relationship in this research has been really wonderful. Carson was being pressured by a lot of friends who knew how horrible DDT was. She'd already published her famous book and was already well known as a wonderful author for now I'm going to blank on the book. No, the book before that, Under the Sea Wind. And so they were pressuring her to write what became Silent Spring, and which was a terribly different book. It was an account, she had to take on the chemical companies, and who then went after her. And it's a whole long story that I can't go into tonight. But she wrote E.B. White at the New Yorker. She had published a lot of her work already in the New Yorker, so they knew each other. Catherine knew her. And she asked E.B. White to write the book about exposing the DDT. And in his wisdom, he wrote back and he said, "I'm very interested in this. I want to publish it in the New Yorker. You should write it." Which is absolutely correct. She was a fabulous writer, and she did the kind of homework that only she could do, and did this amazing book. And the other mutual friend, or the delight that I took, is the relationship of Elizabeth Bishop, the great American poet. And I have her letters to the New Yorker. There's a volume like this of her letters to the New Yorker, half of which are to Catherine White, who was the poetry and fiction editor for years. And there are some delightful letters in there. And Elizabeth Bishop rented a place up on that island where I went last summer, North Haven, thank you, yes. So several summers, Elizabeth Bishop was up there, and there was a conference. Well, anyway, she ended up in Brooklyn and visited the farm, and there are some letters about her visit with the Whites in Brooklyn, which is really lovely to read about and to imagine them together. So, other questions, thoughts? Yes, yes.
How did you get all of your resources? Are all the letters printed?
Oh, yes, that's why I brought the books to look at them, yes. And I would really encourage you not to read the excerpts. His granddaughter, Martha White, Joel's daughter, is that right? Yeah. A beautiful collection of quotes, but I found them frustrating because they were too short. As you saw, I read long quotes, which is technically, they were technically too long, but you can't take just a small chunk of White out of context. I don't think it works. So I was frustrated with her book. And there's another book of her quotes about dogs. And again, they were just too short to really work. And his essays are all fairly short. They were all published in the New Yorker really encourage you to read the essays, especially One Man's Meat. That's the best to start with, I would think, and especially if you live up here and are in the country mode. They're just delightful, and they all of them have this incredible combination of this. As I hope you heard tonight, this detailed attention to the present. And this beautiful detail of the barn or getting his eggs in the mail and going down to the post office, whatever. And then it's always tied in with the major issues of the day. And so subtly and powerfully. And he doesn't hold back. I mean, he was very clear where he stands on these issues. But he makes it palatable. One of the things that we have so much trouble with today is the environment. The news of the environment is so dire that we just can't bear to talk about it. We don't know how to share the news, and then of course the news of everything over the last month has been so dire that it's like, please, you can't talk about it. It's dinner time, no talking about it. But we have to talk about it. So how do we talk about horrible, tragic things going on right now? And I think White is a fabulous guide for how to do that. How to mix the present and the beauty of nature and what we so want to preserve, at the same time naming the enemy and talking about what we have to do to resist this disaster that's happening. And with the humor and the twist and the irony, it's just so beautiful how he does it. There's one passage that about nationalism, and he's looking out his window and he's talking about how much he loves the view out the window. This is in Brooklyn, Maine. He's looking at his farm and he describes in detail how beautiful it is. And then he says, this is what the soldiers are fighting for, is this love of his country. But we have to go beyond nationalism, and we have to be willing to give up this beloved view for the sake of peace. I'm really not getting this quite right. Okay. I have 2 more minutes, yes? Yes. Let me do it the right way. Here, this is from Intimations from his book, One Man's Meat. The passionate love of America, this is a good thing to end on, actually. The passionate love of Americans for their America will have a lot to do with winning the war. This was written in 1941. And he was totally in favor of the war. He's not a pacifist, as you could gather from what I've already read. The passionate love of Americans for their America will have a lot to do with the winning the war. It is an odd thing, though. The very patriotism on which we now rely is the thing that must eventually be in part relinquished if the world is ever to find a lasting peace and an end to these butcheries. To hold America in one's thoughts is like holding a love letter in one's hand. It has so special a meaning. Since I started writing this column, snow has begun falling again. I sit in my room watching the reenactment of this stagey old phenomena outside the window. For this picture, for this privilege, this cameo of New England with snow falling, I would give everything. Yet all the time I know that this very loyalty, this feeling of being part of a special place, this respect for one's native scene, I know that such emotions have had a big part in the world's wars. Who is there big enough to love the whole planet? We must find such people for the next society. And listen to this. From supranationalism often seems hopelessly, although supranationalism often seems hopelessly distant or impractical, there is one rather encouraging sign in the sky. We have lately at least one large new group of people to whom the planet does come first. I mean, scientists. Science, however undiscriminating it has seemed in the bestowal of its gifts, has no disturbing club affiliations. It eschews nationality. It is preoccupied with an atom, not an atoll. Before you can be a supranationalist, you have first to be a naturalist. You have first to be a naturalist and feel the ground under you making a whole circle. It is easier for a man to be loyal to his club than to his planet. The bylaws are shorter and he is personally acquainted with other members. A club, moreover, or a nation, has a most attractive offer to make. It offers the right to be exclusive. America first. There are not many of us who are physically constituted to resist this strange delight, this nourishing privilege. It is at the bottom of all fraternities, societies, orders. It is at the bottom of most trouble. The planet holds out no such inducement. The planet is everybody's. All it offers is the grass, the sky, the water, and the ineluctable dream of peace and fruition.
Where was that from?
One Man's Meat.